August 17, 2023. A federal gun range at the Federal Correctional Institution in Phoenix, Arizona. The air is thick with the smell of gunpowder and the oppressive desert heat. It's supposed to be a place of precision, of control, a place where federal agents sharpen the skills that keep them alive. But a routine firearms training session is about to end in a shocking tragedy. Inside a small, concrete observation room, IRS Special Agent Patrick Bauer is bleeding on the floor. He has a single, catastrophic gunshot wound to his torso. The man who shot him is not an adversary, not a criminal, but his own colleague and the session's defensive tactics instructor, Larry Edward Brown Jr. There is no mystery about who pulled the trigger. Brown himself ran from the room, shouting in a panic that he'd messed up, that he had shot his fellow agent. It looked like a tragically clear-cut case of criminal negligence. An expert instructor, a man tasked with teaching safety, had violated the most fundamental rules of firearm handling, and it had cost another man his life. But when the case went to a federal court, the story that unfolded was far more complex, and the defense strategy far more shocking than anyone could have ever imagined. An IRS firearms instructor shoots and kills a fellow agent during a training exercise. He admits he pulled the trigger, and there are witnesses. The case seems open and shut, a textbook example of involuntary manslaughter. So how did Larry Brown walk out of a federal courtroom a free man, acquitted of all charges? This is the story of a shocking death, the explosive emotional fallout, and the unbelievable courtroom strategy that led to a verdict that, for the victim's family and many in law enforcement, still defies belief. For the 16 investigators of the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit in Phoenix, it was supposed to be a standard day of pistol qualifications. Overseeing the session was Special Agent Patrick Bauer, a 15-year veteran of the agency, a husband, and a father of 4, known for his leadership and expertise. Assisting him was Larry Edward Brown Jr., who had been a special agent since 2011. Brown wasn't just any agent. He was a designated defensive tactics instructor, responsible for leading a classroom session that very day. The two agents weren't just colleagues, they were friends. In a later statement, Brown would describe Bauer as a mentor, someone who was like a brother to him. The day's live-fire exercises were over, and the agents were packing up their gear. Bauer and Brown were the only two left inside the tower, a small, one-room cement building, measuring just 8 by 9 feet, used to observe training. It was a tiny, confined space where, as multiple witnesses would later testify, there was absolutely no reason for a live weapon to even be unholstered, let alone pointed at another person. Then, an agent who had just stepped outside to get his phone heard it, a single, deafening gunshot. Seconds later, the door to the tower flew open and Larry Brown ran out, shouting, "I fucked up, I shot Pat." Inside, his colleagues found Patrick Bauer on the ground, bleeding from a single, devastating wound to his upper torso. The bullet from Brown's Glock 19 had pierced 6 of his internal organs, causing massive internal bleeding. What followed was chaos. Fellow agents rushed to help, desperately trying to administer first aid, forming a chest seal to help Bauer breathe, and calling 911. Bauer was alive, and in his agony, he reportedly uttered his last words. "Larry's an effing idiot." He was rushed to the hospital but died during surgery. In the immediate aftermath, a distraught Larry Brown was taken to a different medical center, where he was diagnosed with an acute stress reaction. According to a report from FBI agent Taylor Hanna, who was at the hospital, a distraught Brown kept repeating to himself, "I am a defensive tactics instructor. I should know better." The expert himself had handled his firearm in a way that resulted in the death of his friend and colleague. For the U.S. Attorney's Office, this wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a federal crime. The government moved swiftly. A federal grand jury indicted Larry Brown on 1 count of involuntary manslaughter of a United States officer, a charge that carried a maximum penalty of 8 years in prison. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Monica Ryan, built its case on a simple, powerful idea: gross negligence. In a federal courtroom, involuntary manslaughter isn't about proving an intent to kill. It's about an unintentional killing that happens because someone acted with a reckless disregard for human life. And the government was prepared to argue that Larry Brown's actions were the very definition of reckless. Ryan told the jury, "This was not an accident. This was reckless." Their argument was methodical. First, Larry Brown wasn't just any agent. He was a trained use-of-force instructor. This meant he should be held to an even higher standard of care. He was the person responsible for enforcing the rules, not shattering them in the most catastrophic way possible. Second, he violated the most sacred and universal rules of firearms safety. Prosecutors methodically ticked off the cardinal sins Brown had apparently committed. Always treat a gun as if it's loaded, never point it at anything you aren't willing to destroy, and keep your finger off the trigger until you are ready to fire. For Brown's Glock 19 to fire, the trigger had to be pulled. An FBI firearms examiner testified it was highly unlikely the weapon simply misfired, noting the Glock is one of the safest there is. This meant Brown had to have taken out his service weapon inside that tiny room, pointed it directly at Patrick Bauer, and squeezed the trigger. Third, the prosecution presented what they believed was a damning admission from Brown himself. FBI agent Taylor Hannah was ready to testify that she heard Brown say, "I am a use of force instructor. I should know better." While Brown's lawyers would later deny he ever said this, the agent stood by her report. To add even more emotional weight, prosecutors got Bauer's reported last words. "Larry's an effing idiot," admitted into evidence under the excited utterance exception, arguing a statement made in a moment of extreme stress is likely to be truthful. The picture painted for the jury was clear. A highly trained expert, in a moment of shocking and inexplicable recklessness, broke every rule he was sworn to uphold, and it cost his friend his life. It seemed like a slam dunk. Brown's defense team, led by seasoned Phoenix federal criminal defense attorney Jason Lamb, took a bold and controversial approach. They wouldn't deny that Brown pulled the trigger. Instead, they would argue that his actions, while tragic, did not rise to the level of a crime. More importantly, they would introduce an explosive new theory, that other, systemic failures were the real cause of Patrick Bauer's death. Their entire strategy was to build a wall of reasonable doubt, brick by shocking brick. Their first pillar of defense was to attack the how and why. While the prosecution called it recklessness, the defense framed it as a horrific, unexplainable accident between two friends. Lamb threw hypotheticals at the jury. What if Bauer had asked to see the weapon? What if Bauer himself had touched the gun, causing it to go off? Lamb argued that the government's investigation had failed to secure key evidence or conduct tests that could have clarified what happened. His point was simple. Since the prosecution couldn't prove exactly how or why the gun was fired, they couldn't prove criminal recklessness beyond a reasonable doubt. But the second pillar of their defense was the one that stunned the courtroom. They shifted the blame from the shooting to the emergency response after the shooting. They brought in a medical expert, Dr. Kenji Inaba, a trauma surgeon from Los Angeles, who dropped a bombshell on the courtroom. Dr. Inaba testified that Patrick Bauer would have, more likely than not, survived if only he'd gotten to the hospital sooner. The defense hammered on the timeline. After the shot, chaos and confusion reigned because, as defense attorney Jeffrey Jacobson stated, the IRS had no emergency response plan in place. In 9/11 audio played in court, frantic agents could be heard, none of whom knew the exact address to give the dispatcher, causing confusion with another nearby range. It took nearly 25 minutes for the ambulance just to leave the scene, and another 14 to reach the hospital. The defense argued that this avalanche of failures was the true cause of death. They even pointed out that other federal agents at the scene had offered to drive Bauer to the hospital in an SUV, a move that could have saved nearly 20 minutes, but were denied. It was a stunning, and to many, an appalling strategy. Bauer's family was horrified, later releasing a statement that said, "It was appalling to sit and listen to the defense accuse the first responders for the death of Patrick." The defense even made first responders cry on the stand as they recounted their desperate efforts to save Bauer's life, only to have their actions framed as a failure. The prosecution's own medical examiner, Dr. Kevin Horn, shot back, stating Bauer's injuries were so catastrophic he likely would have died no matter what. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The defense wasn't saying the paramedics were malicious, they were saying the system failed. And that failure, they argued, is what truly killed Patrick Bauer. So the stage was set for a dramatic conclusion. On one side, a clear case of gross negligence by a firearms expert. On the other, a tragic accident made fatal by what the defense called a botched and chaotic emergency response. The jury had to decide. Before we get to the verdict that left the courtroom reeling, if you find these deep dives into the justice system compelling, be sure to subscribe for more stories that prove nothing is ever as simple as it seems. After a 2-week trial, during which the defense twice asked for an acquittal due to lack of evidence, a request the judge denied, stating the prosecutor had provided enough evidence for a conviction. The jury left to deliberate. They were back in just 90 minutes. When they returned, the court clerk read the verdict. Not guilty. Larry Brown sobbed and embraced his mother. Across the courtroom, Patrick Bauer's family was shattered. One woman threw her purse against the wall in anger. Others yelled at Brown as they left the courtroom. You fucking coward! You killed my fucking brother, and you fucking know it, you piece of shit! One woman screamed. The Bauer family later released a scathing statement saying, Justice was not served today. The jury got this dead wrong. So, how did this happen? The answer lies in two words: reasonable doubt. To convict Brown of involuntary manslaughter, the prosecution had to prove, beyond all reasonable doubt, that his actions were criminally reckless and that his recklessness was the direct cause of death. That controversial defense strategy of blaming the emergency response? It was devastatingly effective. A juror didn't have to be 100% convinced that the first responders or the lack of a plan were at fault. They just needed a tiny sliver of doubt, a question mark over whether the gunshot alone was the guaranteed cause of death. If there was even a chance Bauer could have been saved, as the defense's expert Dr. Inaba testified, then one cannot be certain beyond a reasonable doubt that Brown's action was the sole reason he died. The defense successfully blurred the line between a terrible accident and a prosecutable crime, convincing 12 jurors that while Larry Brown was responsible for the shooting, he was not criminally liable for the death. After the verdict, Larry Brown spoke publicly for the first time. Reading from a statement, he offered condolences to the Bauer family and said, Pat was a great man. He was a mentor and like a brother to me. I miss him every day. But for Bauer's family, the words were empty. In a statement to the press, his family said, It is beyond me how a jury of 12 could agree that those who tried so hard to save him were ultimately more responsible for my brother's death than the man who pulled the trigger. The acquittal sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community, a stark reminder that a courtroom isn't necessarily about moral truth, it's about legal proof. The story that wins is the one a jury believes beyond a reasonable doubt. For Patrick Bauer's family, the verdict was an unforgivable failure of justice, feeling as though Larry Brown had taken Patrick twice from us. For the defense, it was the system working exactly as designed, protecting a man from a criminal conviction for what they successfully framed as a catastrophic accident, not a crime. The case of Larry Brown and Patrick Bauer leaves us with heavy questions about accountability, responsibility, and that razor-thin line that separates a fatal mistake from a federal crime.